Hello, everybody. Welcome to Queen Mary's Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences. My name is Daniel Lee, and I teach in the School of History here at Queen Mary. The IHSS was established in 2018 to bring together scholars from across the faculty's 8 schools to share ideas, develop research, and explore innovative approaches to scholarly and public problems alike. Every year, scholars work together exploring a different theme. The IHSS's annual theme this year is aftermaths. And as we live through the immediate present of the COVID-19 pandemic, we take this opportunity to think about epidemics past and their aftermaths today. The IHSS is delighted to host the UK launch of Anjuli Fatima Raza Kolb's new book, Epidemic Empire, published with the University of Chicago Press. Anjuli's book charts the literary and discursive history behind the ubiquitous figure of the terrorism epidemics and calls for comparative and post-colonial methods for the study of the political present. Writing about Anjuli's book, Jasbir Puar, professor of women's and gender studies at Rutgers University, noted that the work, and I quote, is uncannily prescient, yet historically profound. It allows us to glimpse the future of pandemics from the racial prisms of the past. The temporal arc is sublime and the writing exquisite, end of quote. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Anna Bonham for all of her support in making today's event possible. Chicago University Press is kindly offering a 20% discount to people who have registered for today's event at Queen Mary. Anna will post details of how to purchase the book in the chat. After Anjuli's presentation and comments from the panel, we're going to open the floor to questions. Please do unmute yourselves and turn on your camera, if you choose. Anjuli is particularly interested in responding to questions from students, so please don't be shy. It now gives me great pleasure to formally introduce our guest speaker and our panel in the order that they will speak. Anjuli Fatima Raza Kolb is a scholar, poet, and translator who received her PhD in comparative literature at Columbia University. Her poems, essays, and translations from Urdu have appeared in Discourse, the LA Review of Books, Boston Review, Words Without Borders, and many more places. Anjuli has taught at Bard, Williams College, City College, New York, and the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. In 2019, she was appointed to an associate professorship in English at the University of Toronto, where she teaches poetry and post-colonial theory and literature. Anjuli has recently finished a poetry collection, and among her new projects, she plans to undertake a book-length documentary poem on the Indus Waters Treaty of 1960, and an academic book for Chicago on special commodities, sugar, water, and world literature. Anjuli is already a friend of Queen Mary, having zoomed into my autumn seminar on the Algerian War, where she left her mark on the thinking of second-year students, some of whom I can see are here today. I will now introduce the 3 respondents. Our first commentator is Churnjeet Mahn, who is reader in English at the University of Strathclyde and a fellow of the Young Academy of Scotland, the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Her research investigates the history and practice of travel with reference to race, sexuality, and nationalisms. Her early work investigated the competing discourses of Orientalism, Hellenism, and Philhellenism in Greece in the wake of its independence from the Ottoman Empire. After this, she worked on a project about histories of creativity and resistance in post-partition Punjab. Churnjeet is currently working on a book about queer travel writing, which investigates the history of queer travel to and from the Muslim world. Our second commentator is Elizabeth Marcus, who is a newly appointed lecturer in French and Francophone studies at Newcastle University. She is a scholar of the 19th and 20th century Francophone and Arab worlds. Elizabeth's first book looks at the afterlife of the French Empire in Lebanon and offers a new cultural study of decolonization from below. In it, she examines the long shadows of colonialism in law, literature, and the social sciences, and studies some of the mechanisms of neo-imperialism in the present. Elizabeth is also at work on a book about left and right-wing transnational political and cultural activism in France at the height of European decolonization. Our final commentator is Kim Wagner, who is Professor of Global and Imperial History at Queen Mary. He has written extensively on the subject of Thuggee, the uprising of 1857 and colonial violence. His most recent publications include The Skull of Alun Beg, The Life and Death of a Rebel of 1857, and Amritsar, 1919, An Empire of Fear and the Making of a Massacre. Kim is currently working on American atrocities against Muslims in the Philippines during the early 20th century. So the format for today is as follows. Anjuli will present her new book, and this will be followed by our three panelists. I've given them the impossible task of keeping their comments at around 4 minutes. Anjuli will have a chance to respond to the comments before opening up to questions. Anjuli, welcome to the IHSS. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks especially to Anna Bonham for all of her organizational work in putting this together, and to Simon Reed Henry, Director of the Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences at Queen Mary. But most heartfelt thanks especially to Daniel Lee. Thank you, Dan. You conducted a truly staggering amount of correspondence, and I feel incredibly lucky to have had the chance to talk with you about the ideas in the book, as much as about logistics over the last months. I'm very excited to be with you all, and I'm especially honored to be thinking today with these three brilliant commentators, Liz, Churnjeet, and Kim, and to celebrate the release of my first book. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to keep my comments extremely brief because I really look forward to talking. It is not every academic book that comes out at a moment when its topics have become extremely important to our entire social fabric. And so I'm most excited and curious to hear reactions from the audience and the commentators. In Epidemic Empire, Colonialism, Contagion, and Terror, 1817 to 2020, I study the overlapping discursive, literary, political, and medical histories that have made the notion of an epidemic of terrorism a defining strain of common sense in the 21st century. I've come to think of this book as a deep dive into a shallow metaphor with all of the potential risks that entails. This phrase and its various metaphorical elaborations have defined contemporary Islamophobia. Islam and Islamism have been called a cancer on the human condition, a plague on reason and progress, embedded and insidious retroviruses, ideological contagions. Although I began the book long before the COVID-19 pandemic, long before the COVID-19 pandemic, our moment has had no shortage of intersections with the research I did. In addition to the absolutely shocking and nightmarish spike in hate crimes against Asian Americans, much like the hate crimes against those perceived to be Muslim in the years after September 11th, the virus was immediately associated with indiscriminate Asianness, and those who appeared to be other in the European and North American contexts have suffered grave harm as scapegoats for the kind of thinking drummed up by villainous politicians, including the former President of the United States. At the start of the outbreak, anticipating a dramatic wave of COVID-19 following Eid al-Fitr, the Western media wondered whether Muslim gatherings would become super spreader events, and mosques in Salt Lake City and Missouri were vandalized and burned in apparent hate crimes. The same politicians who called for essential workers and the elderly to martyr themselves to the economy pathologized Muslim martyrdom just years before. The conceptual and moral incoherence of this moment is staggering. Viral, epidemic, and pandemic figures typically work to maintain a clash of civilizations thesis of the kind popularized by Samuel Huntington in his 1996 book of the same name. In my own archive, I look at how commentators on the Algerian Revolution, the Indian Mutiny of 1857, the conflict in Kashmir, the Iranian Revolution, and the current global migration crisis, for example, reach for the forceful image of Islamist and terrorist epidemics in order to shore up a notion of the healthy civilizations of the global north, while at the same time constructing the global South, post-colonial states, and the quote unquote Muslim world, terms that are used in strategically imprecise ways, as zones of rampant infection, roiling virality, and raging epidemic, poised to break out at any moment and fell the global order. Disease in this imaginary is conjured as an analog for rebellious, mutinous, insurgent, or irregular violence. Categories outside of a concept of just war that create a foundation for theories and legal definitions of terrorism as a particularly virulent species of non-state or anti-state violence. In this framework, I argue all acts of war and neo-imperial expansion and soft annexation are recoded as acts somehow of care. I'm going to turn things over to the three discussants who I'm delighted to get to speak with today. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Anjuli. So now we'll turn immediately to Churnjeet.
Thank you. And I just want to begin by saying it's such an honor and a pleasure to be a respondent. To hear some of my thoughts about reading this brilliant book. And I feel like someone should hold it up so we can just admire its cover. Harry Kunzer's 2002 debut novel, The Impressionist, sets one of its opening scenes in the midst of the influenza epidemic in 1919. As the protagonist's father is dying of influenza, his fevered dreams birth his worst nightmares. And here's a quote from the text. Bloated faces and a sound of coughing follow him through streets where the very houses and shops seem to melt into one another, losing their integrity, invaded by their own unstoppable architectural diseases. The dream people are horrific and indistinct. At a look or touch, they blur into one another, woman into man, black into white, low into high. It seems the epidemic will obliterate all conceivable distinctions, hybridizing his whole world into one awful, undifferentiated mass. End quote. We're used to seeing contagion as metaphor everywhere, and as Epidemic Empire brilliantly illustrates through sources as various as Bram Stoker's Library and the 9/11 Commission report, how real moments of insurgency from the Indian Mutiny to 9/11 have been cast as disease that threatens to cast its deathly pall across the healthy nation. I think one of the most powerful dimensions of this book is its methodology. Its eccentric asynchronicity is what's required to reveal the circulation of tropes which are literary hyperbole in one setting, but can migrate into government report and medical textbook. In other words, actionable data and intelligence. Getting out of our disciplinary silos becomes an imperative. Part of the way metaphors of disease can become naturalized is through us failing to make connections. Anjuli could be in a really convoluted and archive-orientated episode of House. This is a story, and I mean story as the greatest compliment here, because of their special relationship to truths, where the search for our patient zero materializes how the project of the West, a project of whiteness, used the language of disease as part of its disciplinary arsenal. In a discussion of Bram Stoker's Dracula, we read, and here's a quote from a book, rather than simply calling Dracula a horror novel, as well as a written account of our bureaucratization, I want to insist that the novel's semi-archival form shows us how, in a colonial sense, the two are mutually constitutive, how horror becomes a fundamental aspect, a framework of imperial bureaucracy, end quote. These are compelling and well-argued points and made me want to read more about contingent forms of contagion. For example, queer sexualities. The report to the International Sanitary Conference, which appears in the Blue Plague chapter, has an interesting point about Hindu pilgrimage and cholera outbreaks, which references debauchery. Dracula belongs to one of the queerest subgenres of the Gothic. And if there was a panic around contagious threat of the Indian Mutiny, then as Jessica Hinchey has shown, there were also panics around hijras in parts of northern India at the same time. As Richard Burton has pointed out, there's something about unnatural sexual practices, sodomy and some other practices left to the imagination, which seem to be, particularly in his word, endemic in the Oriental world. Is there a queer dimension to this contagion story? One where the healthy straight white body is threatened by contagiously queer orient, which is of course part of Poir's thesis, which is touched on in the book. And here's part of the success of Epidemic Empire. It is generous and capacious enough in its thinking to encourage connections. This is a work which is already significant. There are endless examples to be added to this archive, from the Komagato Maru incident in 1914 in Canada, where recent work has shown how public health measures were used to help prevent Indian migrants migrate into Canada, some of whom were affiliated to the Ghadar Party, a radical anti-colonial movement, to public health measures in the UK from the 1960s onwards, designed to target and contain the problem of South Asian communities, something which our communities have paid the price for dearly in the past year. And this leads me to my final thought. Imagine it's 2025, there's a new edition of this book, and there will be new editions of this book. Anjuli, you're writing a new preface. What would it say? What would you add now? Where do the threads connect and take us? I'm going to stop here, but I would just like to add that if there is any Chapatis Against Empire merch, please count me in. And if you don't know that reference, you're going to have to read the book. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Churnjeet. Okay, we're now going to turn to Elizabeth.
It's a real pleasure to be participating today and to hear from everyone here. And there are two main points I would like to make about Anjuli's work that are particularly productive for me. First, about interdisciplinary scholarship, and that kind of follows on from Churnjeet's comments. And the second is about the writing of imperial history. When I clicked on a video of one of the talks Anjuli recently gave, an advert came up. And it was of a masterclass in writing with Salman Rushdie. And in this advert, Rushdie, one of the key interlocutors of Anjuli's book, suggests that for an exercise, he asks his students to write 300 words on the place they are writing about, but without using any adjectives. What this forces you to do, he says, is to actually tell a story about the place. What I presume he wants in this exercise is to encourage his students to seek clarity, to go beneath decorative description, and to find the facts and biography of the thing that they are writing about. While I didn't sign up to the course, it did make me think about one of the key moves that subtend Anjuli's book. What stories are revealed when figurative language is taken away? Like Rushdie in this exercise, Anjuli wants to go under the hood of metaphors associated with terrorism and disease. But I also think she takes this masterclass in two different directions. First, the uniqueness of her approach partly lies in the argument that metaphor itself requires historical location and analysis and is historically contingent. And second, the book presents us with a challenge. When does a metaphor stop being one and become instead an empirical description of how things work? Because in bringing history to unexpected and even inhospitable places, Anjuli shows the interwoven nature of poetic and empirical truths. For me, the most powerful chapters that do this in the book examine how this works in French Algeria. In fact, one of the things that Anjuli so beautifully does is to connect things people most often think as separate. So the two chapters in the center of the book on French Algeria help me understand why French imperial anxiety to control bodies and to control land was also accompanied by an interest in controlling speech, and in particular, the spread of false news and rumor. What this makes me want to know more about is how this anxiety over political speech works in conditions of colonial displacement, say in present-day France, Britain, and the US. Because her work opens up for me new ways of seeing why France, only a few weeks ago, proposed banning homeschooling in the spirit of resisting what is called Islamic separatism. Transmission, and in this case of knowledge, risks flowing into the wrong political body. So in this way, I think the book helps to produce its own theory of time, because Anjuli punctures the logic of linear history writing and the pedestals of historians themselves, who, as Priya Satya examines in her most recent book, furnish the alibi and conceptual terrain of imperialism. But here, Anjuli shows that it is the literary and the circulation of literary mechanisms that have helped produce imperial and neo-imperial projects. And so, like the metaphor she traces, Anjuli moves fluidly between geographic spaces and time in order to trace how this figure of speech was both an organizing principle of imperial government and how it underwrites present-day discourses and policies. And so I wonder whether, given your critique, Anjuli, of metaphor, are there risks in organizing knowledge in the present around literary mechanisms in the first place? But beyond tracing this wild and mobile metaphor of terror and epidemic and the chiasmatic relationship between politics and literature, disease and violence, speech and action, Anjuli's work, I think, is a model of comparative empire studies, methodologically speaking. Because first of all, historians in recent years have taught us that many phenomena and structures have imperial histories. Not just things like imperial institutions, such as those that govern global health, but also the very epistemic structures of knowledge like the humanities and the social sciences. Anjuli's rich archive adds to this broad research area by uncovering the imperial origin story of the medical and scientific practices of epidemiology. But she also takes this history 2 steps further. She tracks epidemic discourse and epistemic practices across different geographic and temporal frames: Algeria, India, Britain, and America, areas that are rarely brought together, and attends to their specific and local histories outside of the ones set by empire. And this, I think, it is in this way, I think, that Anjuli's book does something that my field of imperial history is still working out how to do. Because she doesn't just tell a cause and effect story. This book also shows why this scientific revolution occurred, why it was tethered to figurative practices of terror and disease, and the material effects of this association. In other words, I think her methodology can help challenge historiographical givens and help transform the very categories and analysis of linear models that structure most imperial histories. Finally then, that our workaday vocabulary today contains words like contagion, quarantine, and transmission, when we can see how politics and policymaking of exclusion and borders, viral competition, and what the historian Catherine Olivarius calls immunocapital, are so connected to theories and vocabularies of disease, this book has helped me think more precisely about how the histories of certain concepts structure our present day, and how rhetoric is necessarily and inherently a part of that story.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Next we have Kim.
Kim, I think you're still muted.
That's what you get for being a teacher during lockdown. You could use to muting yourself. Anyway, here we go. Thank you very much for inviting me to comment on this book, which does something that historians can't do, which is cover really broad period spans. It's a really ambitious, both chronologically and geographically. But what is really nice about it is the way that the colonial past is linked to our, not exactly post-colonial, but rather neo-imperial present. in new and quite innovative ways. And Anjuli's work really sort of speaks to, in a very broad and comprehensive sense, the many different ways in which colonial anxieties, political anxieties, and issues of security were at the same time linked to concerns about epidemics, health in sort of widest understanding. In some ways, it reminded me a bit of the work of Robert Peckham's Empires of Panic, or indeed Mike Vann's brilliant work, The Great Rat Massacre of Hanoi, which really interweaves sort of these sort of imperial anxieties. I was particularly pleased to see Donald Trump's pig blood anecdote. Any scholar who raises that story, I've time for that. That is, of course, one of the perhaps most horrific examples of the kind of colonial knowledge being resurrected, most recently during Donald Trump's election campaign in 2016, which thank God is now history, in which he talked about the use of pig's blood, bullets dipped in pig's blood to use against Muslims by the Americans in the Philippines. And there is indeed a very, very long history of using a particularly medicalized and pathologized language to really delegitimize any kind of indigenous.
Sorry, you're muted.
Sorry, I just got a phone. I'm on my phone. So I've got two questions, really, which is about how does this focus on contagion and disease, how does that map onto another quite prevalent trope within the colonial imaginary, especially when we talk about the so-called threat of Muslims, which is namely that of a mental illness and the really propensity to pathologize Islamic fanaticism within a sort of whole range of different tropes, Amok being one of them, but there is an entire sort of body of colonial legal text and kind of work that's been done by Mark Kundus, Liz Kolsky, and a range of other people. Of course, pathologizing in terms of irrationality and mental illness does correlate to some extent to illness and epidemics, but it's not exactly the same. So there is a different medical discourse that is also at play. So that's one point. Another point, I mean, of course, there's many issues that could be raised in this wonderfully ambitious study. The idea of particular people as being contagions is sadly one of the sort of most persistent tropes in human history. I'm thinking, of course, about medieval anti-Semitism, the ideas of Jews as being a source of contagion, but we saw it again, and to some extent, the book covers it in the context of Dracula and the fear of migrants. But yellow peril fears, as they emerged in the early 20th century, is also very much about the movement of bodies and non-white bodies in particular. But we also see this metaphor of the epidemic and sort of spread of disease in the context of communism and a whole range of other tropes throughout the 20th century. So I was wondering whether, Anjuli, you could sort of unpack a bit how you identify this one particular strand, pardon me the pun, of an epidemiological language in this context. And I think I'll stop rambling here. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Kim. Okay, so Anjuli, over to you again.
Thank you. Thank you for these incredibly generative questions. I think what I'd like to do is begin by thinking through some of what Kim just raised, and then I will back up because both Churnjeet and Elizabeth's questions are kind of pointing me to work that I'm doing now and thinking that I'm doing now. So to begin, I think regarding the kind of question that you ended with, Kim, there are, I mean, we could be back at Thucydides, and we could be in almost any context in recorded both orally and visually and textually and literarily world history, and find contagion metaphors. You're absolutely right to point that out. This is already, as you note, a massive book that treats a number of different areas geographically and temporally. So I think what I'd like to say is there is no real, to my mind, there's no real work to be done on the broader category of the other as contagious vector. That is a kind of common sense, and it is only, for me, the door into a more specific and historicizable project. It is that specific and historicizable project that I wanted to investigate in this book. And creating a set of delineations, albeit quite broad delineations, was what allowed me to start getting into the material histories. So one really crucial moment in my research was identifying the development of the discipline of epidemiology, which is a really nice moment for distinguishing a kind of loose, undisciplined, and unsystematized theory of contagion from a disciplinary, methodologically structured, self-conscious practice of colonial knowledge making. And so that crucial sort of twist in the middle of the 19th century, I considered enabling rather than disabling. It helped me take a history of kind of world relations or immunological contact and turn it into a research question that was profoundly and personally important to me because of the genesis of the project in the resurgence of this discourse after 9/11. And I think what I would say now is that those other historical contexts, those other groups of people that have been pathologized, those other groups of rebels that have been pathologized, other political movements like communism, actually the relationship between diasporic Jews and communism in the United States is an interesting area for this research. But none of it had extremely important explanatory force for the question that I believed was shaping our global present, which was the launching of the longest US war in history. And that's why this question was, for me, the one that I thought I could dig into and provide something more than a kind of vague observation, which of course is true, that every other has been pathologized. And so moving away from that vagueness and toward a kind of specific and researchable question was enabling for me. On the topic of mental illness, there are a number of histories that I think, that were part of the research that didn't wind up in the final version of the book. The one that I want to mention, because it's the most tightly connected to the other work that I do here, it was another chapter at the end of the book in section 3 on terrorism novels. So 9/11 novels and the rash of 9/11 novels that came out in, I think it was limited to the 10 years after that event, many of which were in the kind of business, and I say business pretty seriously and pretty cannily, like they were in the business of what Gayatri Spivak called in her 9/11 essay in Boundary 2, exercising psychological diagnostics. So that chapter kind of became a smaller section in what is now chapter 7 of the book, called The Black Box of the Islamic Subject. And it's really a deep dive into what realist Anglophone and Francophone literary voices seek to do with regard to psychological or psychoanalytic diagnostics, a kind of plumbing of the impossible or unimaginable Muslim subject, its motivations, her harms, his pathologies. And that mental illness moment, I don't know if you guys remember this, but in the Boston Marathon bombings, there was a pair of brothers, the Tsarnaev brothers. And I think that was, for me, perhaps the most violent and egregious armchair psychologizing media moment in the history, in that very new history of terrorism coverage. These boys were young, they were immigrants, they went to Cambridge Rindge and Latin, which is very close to the high school that I went to. And so that kind of psychological diagnostics was not only a part of the stories, Kim, that you raised from other scenes and other places. It's certainly in the 1857 mutiny fanaticism stuff, but that part of the book, I think probably for better, was cut pretty close to the end there. So Yeah, I mean, as a literary scholar, there are other things to say about psychoanalytic reading, but I think one of the things I found in trying to write up that chapter was that I just hated all of the material so much. And again, it felt very obvious. And what I was hoping to do in the book is to provide some deep thinking about common senses that, you know, one couldn't sort of already observe or imagine by reading the news carefully. Okay. Let me stop with that question, and I'm going to move backwards to Churnjeet and Elizabeth's questions, which bring me a bit closer to how I'm thinking now. So Churnjeet, thank you so much for that beautiful summary. And I also just want to say, like, I wish we were together in person, but it's such a pleasure having gotten to see you speak over the last couple of months and to become a new fan and to get to share work with you, I hope, going forward. The question of queerness. So I like to be as transparent as possible about how work is made. Judith Butler was on my dissertation committee. The question of queerness and of specifically of HIV and the contagious discourse of HIV and AIDS has been on my mind from the beginning of this project. I will say before I was queer, which is also a fun fact about life and writing. But it's not in the book. And for some of those reasons are similar to what I was just trying to sort of circumscribe with regard to Kim's question. There are different historical mechanisms at work in the pathologization of otherness, patient zero, the Haitian context, the sub-Saharan African context. Certainly, we've been seeing kind of resurgence of terror about animal eating and exotic lifeways, as we saw in the early HIV/AIDS crisis. And reading about early AIDS research taught me a lot about how to make this book, but it didn't make it into the book for various reasons. I think that just had to do with splaying a little bit too far from the goalpost, which was what is the catastrophe of our present, circa like March 2020, right? So before we were in yet another pandemic. So side research projects have certainly stuff to say about that. With regard to the Dracula chapter, his correspondence with Whitman, Stoker's correspondence with Whitman is sexy and fun and breathless. And certainly the queer context of the vampire novel is a kind of, it's an iconography that hangs over the entire millennial vampire popular fiction surge. But I would also just take this opportunity to point everyone to a brand new book that will be out soon by Tanya Agathocleos, who's at Hunter College and CUNY Grad Center, on the relationship between disaffection and obscenity in the British colonial and print culture context. So we were sort of writing alongside each other as we were finishing these books, and she's done some incredible work on the Oscar Wilde obscenity trial and disaffection in colonial India. You asked about the Komagata Maru, and I'm so glad that you brought this up. I'm working on a series of poems actually about that incident. So these are lyric poems. They're not part of the documentary piece, but another part of this history that I just couldn't compass in the book, but that is with me all the time. These circuits of movement, the pathologization of these circuits of movement, they're really important lodestars for me in my thinking. They just haven't all come out in the same scholarly form. And for those of you who don't know that incident, I would point you to Erica Lee's Beautiful, The Making of Asian America, is a book that covers those incidents and contextualizes them. And this leads me to my final response to you, Churnjeet, which is the question you asked, like, if I could write the preface now, what would it say? I'm not quite ready for that yet. I think the biggest anchor of energy has been over the last year really seeing not just a connected idea, but a proper fourth section of the book that puts the work that I've done already into more direct conversation with genocidal imperial conquest in the United States and Canada. So I mention that because I've been reading Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz's An Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. I've been reading Lindsay Rexon's book that was out last year called Realist Ecstasy, which does some amazing work on the pathologization of religious feeling and ecstasy in Jim Crow era or Reconstruction era secularism. She does some excellent work on the ghost dance. My own reading of Mary Austin's work, mostly for poetry reasons, but to some extent also for pathology research reasons, has been reshaping how I'm thinking, not just about a kind of, again, to the way that I was kind of addressing Kim's question, not just a loose analogy, but something really tight and material is happening between the language of that genocidal war in the US. And it's just not an imperial history that I knew as much about as I should have. So a new preface would certainly talk about that. You know, I have to say, I think I captured as much last March or April as I could now about COVID-19. We knew pretty quickly what social rifts were going to be revealed. And I don't think I have that much more to say about it today than I did, unfortunately, in April. So let me leave it there, and I will turn to Elizabeth's questions just for a couple of brief moments, and also say, again, you know, for the sake of transparency and making sure that we're all clear about the way that scholarship happens in community, I know Elizabeth and I will be talking about this every day for many years to come. And I hope that that's true for others of you as well. So thank you for collaborating with me on making this book, and thank you for asking me these questions today. The issue I'd like to take up briefly is the one that you raise about what are the, I mean, forgive me and maybe correct me if I'm not hearing you exactly right, but basically what are the metaphors now, and what has become of the, someone called it recently, the vanishing point of the epidemic metaphor in a moment of actual pandemicity. It's true that I spent many years of my life trying to highlight a metaphor that we mostly took for granted and didn't see as having a material kind of impact. And now that we're in a pandemic, one forgets the kind of metaphorical, it's very easy to overlook the kind of metaphorical operations that were taking place. I want to say as plainly as possible that the eclipsing of the metaphorical operations of pandemic by an actual pandemic in some senses undo what I've been writing and arguing for years. On the other hand, they really reveal the extent to which the metaphorical epidemic was sucking resources away from the possibility of preventative care and a functioning health system in the United States. So I want to make that as plain as possible every time I talk about this, that the metaphorical epidemic was and continues to be the one that is getting the prophylactic resources behind it. So the trillions of dollars that have been spent on the prevention or therapeutic attempt to epidemiologically deal with terrorism, a metaphorical epidemic, is just straight up money that could have been spent otherwise. And perhaps this is swerving too far from the book, and maybe you'll rein me back in if that's the case, but yeah, I guess I just want to say, like, I'm not done with these, with pulling up the hood on metaphor. The next book that I'm working on, the next academic book that I'm working on is about sugar, water, and world literature. And in some senses, that is itself a kind of weird analogy, putting these three commodities next to each other. But it's also an investigation into two kind of phrases that have become sources of wisdom with regard to education and aesthetics. So in the sugar chapter, I'm really moving out of a kind of literal-minded observation about Matthew Arnold, a Victorian cultural commentator's call for culture to be an instantiation or commitment to sweetness and light. So I'm taking these terms extremely literally. Sweetness cannot be thought apart from the sugar trade in the late 19th century, and light cannot be thought apart from race in the late 19th century. So that's the kind of beginning of that chapter's investigation. Likewise with the water chapter, Peter Cooper, who started the Cooper the design school in downtown Manhattan, also established this school for vocational design. And this means like urban planning and architecture and art as a free school. And he he stated that the school, that education should be as free as air and water. So the second chapter really investigates like, what is an imagination of freedom when it comes to the resources of air and water? What is a pollution burden? How does a pollution burden work in terms of unfreeing or privatizing air? Likewise with water. And then finally with world literature and its institutional life. So these ways of approaching metaphor are like never far from my mind, I think. And they certainly are driving what I'm doing now. I want to make sure that we have some time for questions, and we were trying to keep this to about an hour. So Lizzie, let's talk more about it. And thank you for the question.
That's great, thank you. Everybody, the floor is yours, so don't be shy. Do please raise your virtual hands. I think you click on the reaction button and then you can raise your hand from there. So do put up your hands, or if you can't figure that out, just type into the chat or just unmute. We can all be informal here. So who wants to start us off? I can't believe nobody has a question yet.
I will go.
Please. Hi.
I'll be the scapegoat. Hi. So it's I'm into post-colonialism and into, of course, post-colonial studies, and very interested in that question of contagion and empire as you eminently, bring it together through your analysis. I have not read the book though. But you are definitely inspiring me to read it and buy it. So quite interested on the discount as well. But what I wanted to ask you was, is discourse analysis part of your frame of thinking here as well? Because you were mentioning, metaphors and the mental modeling of the metaphors and the ways in which discourse analysis, analyzes these might be part of, your methodological frame, perhaps. So that's the first question. And the second question is where I wanted to have an idea of how did you get to this research, just to have an idea of what your interests were, really. So that's it. It's a small initial question.
Thank you so much, Leticia. So 100% yes, discourse analysis is absolutely at the base of this. And it's funny, each institution has its sort of like little like centers or common sense, but this was like extremely difficult for my senior colleagues for some years to grasp why I was doing discourse analysis and what is its method and why is it so all over the place. But certainly making the connection that Foucault was not just a theorist of the author or of the carceral state. And like, I like to be clear about this, like also stealing Angela Davis's theories of the carceral state, but that he had been trained as a student of the history of medicine. And that discourse analysis in this sense actually emerged from a kind of long line of thinkers in a French context who were studying colonial epidemics specifically. So François de la Porte, Canguilhem, Foucault in that context was one that I had to come to sort of late, because the Foucault that I understood, from my intro to comp lit and theory, and was a very different Foucault, a student of power. I also weirdly was assigned to Herculine Barbin when I was quite young in school, which is a gorgeous text, but not completely typical if you're trying to figure out, what is this thinker's kind of lineage. And then, of course, the aha moment of realizing that Orientalism, a text that I kept by my bedside, for years and years, was already specifically a Foucauldian project of discourse analysis. This was, it's so incredibly obvious to me now, but it wasn't as I was working. I'll say extremely briefly that I was in New York City as a Pakistani American when the Twin Towers were hit. And so for me, this project was pretty immediate. I had no idea that it was going to be my life's work or my research, but that is where it began. It began with a kind of deep interest in where power resides and can it reside in the disciplines. And I was already convinced that that was true as a student of, young student, college student of post-colonial theory, who then was sort of called to an identity that had been a kind of blank space or a wash in my previous life until I was about 20 years old. That was the genesis of the project for me. And knowing that it mattered so deeply and so personally to me meant that I knew I would sort of stick with it. So thank you for asking that.
Martyn, is your hand up? I thought I saw Martyn Frampton.
It was, and then my internet connection started cutting in and out. So I started writing it down, but I'll have a go at saying it quickly. So I was going to say thank you to all the panelists. I think it's been a really fascinating and sort of thought-provoking session. And my question, such as it was more just, I was really fascinated by what Anjuli was saying about, what you were saying about the kind of Boston bombing, and you kind of gave us a tantalizing glimpse. And then he said it's not in the book, and I'm sorry I don't have the book yet, but I just wondered if you could say a bit more about that episode and kind of what it revealed to you.
Thank you for the question. No, I think when you hold it in your hand and realize that it's over 400 pages, I think you'll be happy that it's not in the book. That episode, you know, it was, here were the differences. And this actually was more true in Britain than it had been in the US. But the big difference was that in 9/11, it was possible for the media and even the commissioners of the 9/11 Commission report to frame the attackers as foreigners. They had spent, and that's not to say that they had spent their entire lives not in the US. A couple of the attackers had gone to college here, which is kind of an interesting sub-thread in the 9/11 Commission report, is like weirdly a defense of the American liberal arts college context. But the Tsarnaev brothers were pretty assimilated. And again, in the British context, I think you saw more of this in those early years after September 11th, a kind of a terror about the immigrants who were already in our midst. This wasn't actually the narrative early on in the American context. It was much more a kind of bin Laden, Saudi Arabia, what happened in Afghanistan, foreign invasion kind of discourse. And in a way, the US was catching up to Britain and France in terms of its xenophobia. That was pretty firmly installed in Europe, and it was not as firmly installed here with regard to Muslim Americans. At which point, you know, Dearborn, Michigan became a purported, I mean, the first Office of Homeland Security on American soil was opened in Dearborn, which is fascinating. It's not where an attack took place. So when the Tsarnaev brothers were in the media, I think there was a lot of confusion and a lot of therapy kind of care talk. They were also teenagers. And I don't know, it started to approach actually the school shooter discourse a little bit more. So there was a kind of interesting movement from the like incomprehensible, terrifying, sublime, like other, and then the kid in the high school. So those two discourses were sort of coming closer and closer together. And I think that, I don't know, this is like sort of like micro geographic Northeast American politics, but I think there was also some weird schadenfreude about the fact that they were from Cambridge, a hotbed of like left liberal, the People's Republic of Cambridge. I'm not, you know, I don't wind up reading, there was a long double profile of those two boys in New York Magazine, which was one of the objects that I was reading in that chapter on 9/11 novels. But in the end, I think I'm trying to say this a few different ways. It was so unbelievably obvious. I was sure that I wasn't teaching anyone anything, that if you spent, you know, 10 minutes with those texts, you would see what I saw immediately. And there wasn't much historical digging that was going to help me pull it into a place where it was really useful scholarship for someone else.
Thank you.
Thanks, Martyn, for the question.
Okay, I think we have time. We still have a whole minute left. So if anybody does have a question, then do feel free to unmute or to put up your hand or to type it in the chat. I know there is still time, but no matter how.
The thing, can I ask, what was the thing that surprised you most?
Thank you for that question. I think perhaps this could be Stockholm syndrome, because I probably read 8,000 to 9,000 pages of early colonial medical writings from 1817 to 1825. But I think what surprised me most was my affection for these completely besotted with science and utterly incorrect doctors and government officials who were trying to figure out what the hell was going on with cholera. It's just moving. They're part of this machinery of empire, but they're also trying so hard. And I think that already was surprising to me when I was doing the research. I was like, oh my God, these poor guys, they're outside, flying their kites and trying to figure out which volcano is making everybody sick. Trying to come up with any theory other than contagion that they could come up with. But certainly to give you a kind of serious coda to that question, I think over the course of the last year, there's also been a poignancy for me in understanding that as a citizen of the world's most evil neo-empire, in the midst of a pandemic, there are people here now who are doing the actual work of care, not the metaphorical defensive empire work of care. And those colonial doctors were part of that, that imperial machinery, but they were also tender and devoted and generous with their patients and with their communities. And that was a shock, actually. It shouldn't have been, but it was.
Thank you. Thanks, Robin, for the question. So I'm afraid our hour is up, everybody. But do go away. The details are in the chat about how to get the Queen Mary discount for this book, this fantastic book. And I'd just like to invite everybody to unmute and to give Anjuli a virtual round of applause, and of course to the commentators. So thank you so much, Anjuli.
Thank you all so much for being here. And I'm extremely Googleable and on Twitter. So if you wind up getting the book and have questions, please don't hesitate to be in touch.
Okay, thank you all. And future events at the IHSS can be found on the website. So enjoy the rest of your rainy days and see you all again in person soon, we hope. Thank you.